Afternoon. I'm Cindy Arnson. I'm delighted to be partnering once again with Idea Internacional in this series of meetings on politics and elections in Latin America in these times of the pandemic. Last weekend, Chileans went to the polls yet again to elect governors and mayors and town councils, but most especially the members of a new Constituent Assembly. These new members, 155 of them in all, will be charged with the task of writing a new constitution to replace the one from 1980 that was drafted during the years of the Pinochet dictatorship. As you'll recall, Chile exploded in street protests in October of 2019, months before the outbreak of COVID, in a mass display of discontent, surprised mostly in the international community, including in Chile, in discontent over many features of Chile's economic model and politics in general. The grievances were numerous, but centered on questions of inequality in education, healthcare, pensions, the insufficiency of incomes for vast sectors of the population, and the ways also that citizens no longer felt represented by politicians of Chile's pacted democratic transition. One of the outcomes of that protest movement, which was shoved underground for these many months, for the most part by the COVID pandemic, was an agreement to draft a new constitution. Last October of 2020, in a plebiscite, Chileans overwhelmingly backed the idea of a new constitution to be drafted by a constituent assembly that would be newly elected, have gender parity, and also have a guaranteed number of seats for Chile's indigenous population. The election last weekend potentially represents a watershed in Chilean politics. The vast majority of new delegates are independents, not tied to any of the traditional political parties. And notably, the center-right and right-wing garnered only about a fifth of the votes, far short of the 1/3 needed to block articles of the new constitution. Last week's vote is just the latest step in this constitutional reform process. The new draft constitution will be subject to a popular vote next year, and all of this takes place in the midst of Chile's preparations for presidential elections this coming November. We have an outstanding panel of Chilean experts to explain the significance of the assembly election, what it means for the future of Chilean politics and its socioeconomic model, and whether a new Magna Carta itself will be capable of addressing the multiple issues that have brought so many hundreds of thousands of Chileans into the streets. I'll introduce briefly the panelists in the order in which they'll speak. First, Claudio Fuentes, who is a professor in the School of Political Science at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago. He will be followed by Carmen Lefoulan, who is a researcher and the coordinator of public opinion studies at the Centro de Estudios Públicos, one of Chile's premier think tanks. Next will be Isabel Aninat, who is Dean of the Law School at the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, and Lucia Dammert, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Universidad de Santiago, Chile. Before introducing and thanking my friend and colleague, Daniel Sovato, who will moderate this discussion, I'd also like to thank Andres Beal and Beatriz Garcia-Nice of the Wilson Center, as well as Katrin Lovell of IDEA for all of their help in organizing today's seminar. And now my pleasure to turn things over to my friend, colleague, Daniel Sovato, the Director for Latin America and the Caribbean of IDEA Internacional.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Good afternoon to all of us who are following this fantastic panel. I'm sure that with these four outstanding speakers and this subject, the outcome and the results of the recent election in Chile, I'm sure that everybody is going to have great time and we are going to learn a lot. Let me explain very briefly the methodology. I'm going to ask each of the 4 speakers to have an initial presentation of around 8 minutes, no more than that, please, in order to then have the opportunity to have a good debate and exchange of questions and answers. Then we are going to go into the Q&A section, and finally I will ask to have for each speaker to make a closing remarks of around 2-3 minutes, and then we will end. We have 90 minutes to address all these issues, and I think that, as I said at the beginning, it's a fantastic opportunity to learn what's going on in Chile. So following the order that was anticipated by Cynthia, Claudio, you have the floor for the next 8 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you, the Wilson Center and Cindy, for the invitation to this event. I will address 3 main issues concerning what is going on in Chile, which is pretty surprising even for us. I think that we are in deep shock for recent events, and at least I am. The first point is the context of the crisis of representation. I think that we are in a deep crisis of political representation and institutional representation. Many of the institutions are very criticized. It's not just lack of trust of citizen trust, but also is a deep disconformidad concerning these institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, the business community, the institutional political representation, the Congress, etc., etc. And in this context, emerged this agreement, the convention constituency in 2019, which at the end of a very 1 year of debate and political struggle became a very interesting experience in terms of representation. I think that it has very high standards of democratic representation. What you, Cindy, were mentioning, parity, the access of indigenous communities in reserved seats, and the list of independents who could compete in this for this election, it was a deep change in society. I think that we are not, we are just processing the changes that we are living. Parity, for instance, is affecting, I think, social life in terms of like the gender representation, and particularly the representation of women in the political power. Indigenous representation is the first time in history that we have an institution in which the indigenous people communities are represented institutionally. I mean, it's a big change in the political and social scheme. So I think that is very, very impressive, this, and I think that we are processing this event. The second point, so high standard of democratic institutions. Second point is what happened on Sunday. I think that given the lack of confidence on political parties, this strong political participation that we all learned in our books in the 90s of the model of Chile of political institutional representation, now we are in deep trouble. I mean, political parties, not we, political parties. And what is interesting and what happened, I think it's not just the emergence of independent people that won seats. 40% of the seats of the convention will be held by independent people, but who are these independent? They are representative of territorial organizations, environmental organizations, grassroots organizations that they are very embedded in the particularly environmental conflicts in the territories. And I think that this is very interesting. Like going back to the sociological Collier and Collier framework, now we will have a convention in which the political arena, 60%, and the social arena are together. And that, I think, is a challenge for political alliances, agreement, during the convention. And I think that that is opening in a new frame for political debate in Chile. This ideal of political parties intermediating between the state and society is totally broken. And now we have a new actor, social actor, is not just independent. I think we will have to see this, that are embedded in the discussion, and they are empowered now, I mean, in the convention. And third, and I end with this, is the low intensity or density of democratic participation. I mean, we have a strong structural problem of 50% of the citizens not participating at all of this process. The plebiscite of October 2020, it was a challenge, and it was a moment in which, I mean, you have two options, very clear, a transparent option, yes or no, approve or reject the idea of having a convention, and only 51% participated. So we have an abstency, a structural abstency, electors that are not participating in this process. And I think that that is a huge challenge for democratic processes. So the question is whether the constituent process during the next year will involve citizens, will open up to re-legitimate a political system, re-legitimate institutions, and that I think is the main challenge for what is going on in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, addressing three critical points: the context in which this election took place, second, the crisis of political parties and the emergence of new actors, the so-called independent. Independence is a terminology that I don't really like it, because it does not have a clear sense about independent from whom. It's people that not necessarily probably belong to a political party, but we will have to see to what extent they are really independent. And finally, the low level of electoral participation, that when we compare with the plebiscite last October, is not only that there is a low level, 43%, but also it decreased 8% from the 51% that was in last October. So very three critical points, and I would like to underwrite your final comment. To what extent the new constitution will have the capacity to legitimate the political system and the democracy in Chile? So thank you so much, and we'll go now to you, Carmen. You have the floor for the next 8 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I prepared a slide. So as Claudia mentioned, within the context of these constitutional conventions, this election is an increase in the disaffiliation from parties. So we have an increasing trend since the early 90s, in which about a fifth or a third of the population did not identify with a political party. And now it's actually the opposite. We have almost 80% of individuals that do not identify with any party. And it's not only disaffiliation, there's a big distrust in parties. Only 8% think that political parties reflect citizen demands. Only 23% thinks political parties are essential for democracy, which is really critical if we think about representative democracy. And furthermore, there is a distrust also of political elites. 82% agree with the statement inequality persists because it favors the rich and the powerful. This distrust it's very relevant for the political parties and the Congress, but we also see a declining trust in municipalities, in the Catholic Church, in the police. So it's an overall level of distrust. And as Claudia mentioned, we have a crisis of political representation. But in a moderating note, not everything is as dark. People still strongly prefer democracy, and even we have a bit higher percent than in last years in 2017. And people want that leaders prioritize agreement over their own position. Furthermore, the citizenship is not polarized, but is, and that's what we see in the last graph. I choose only one. So we have the tension between income inequality and reward individual effort, equality and effort. And we see that it's not a polarized society. So that's an important thing to keep in mind regarding our context. So we're in the midst of a process of democratic deepening with an increased inclusion of forces that were previously not participating and increasing competition. In October 2019, we have a social outburst, and this election of this constitutional convention is framed by this, is caused by this. And it's important to remember that in October 2019, we're in a profound crisis, and we weren't sure what path it would take, and it's very relevant that we were able to follow an institutional path. So we have the plebiscite, and now we have the election of the Constitutional Convention. In order to understand the composition of how the political forces align within the Institutional Convention, there are three key innovations that occurred. So first we have parity, and we could discuss a bit later about that. Here we have the composition of the Chamber of Deputies. And remember, we had a gender quota for that election, but it didn't work. And we can talk about the incentives of a system of parity. And then we have indeed parity in the candidates for the Constitutional Convention, but also, and more importantly, for the convention. We also have a second institutional innovation, which is reserved seats. So by definition, we have 11% of the seats are reserved for pueblos originarios. And we also have another institutional innovation, which is the list of independents. Previously, you were not able to form a list, a coalition of independents. If you wanted to run outside of parties, you had to run as standing alone. But for the Constitutional Convention, it was allowed to form a list of independents, of people not affiliated with parties. So in the first line, you see, well, almost every candidate run on a party list, but for the Constitutional Convention, 39% run as independent in list of independents, not as independents standing alone, sorry, like the 2%, but as list independents. And that changed radically the logic and how independents and not affiliated with parties were elected, as we see in the bottom graph. So overall, we see we have younger members. By definition, we have gender parity and reserved seats. We observe there's a weak political center in the resorts, and also where political parties would weaken, and we observe a substantive renewal. And in short, well, by definition, we have parity in the results, but it's interesting to see where it worked better. So here we have the percent of men and women in the candidates and within the convention, but by party list, by list. So we see the first group, so we have original people. It wasn't the independents that women had a higher share. And we observed, especially in Lista de la Prueba, which is most closely ex-concertación, except that they had a really low percentage of women successful. And we have also the Chile Vamos, a less percentage of women, but smaller. So what we observe here is that the renewal, more women enter, but substantially more within the independent list, and more traditional parties, especially La Lista de la Prueba, did not incorporate women in the Constitutional Assembly. We also see, and here we can also compare age groups. So green is candidates and orange is the convention. We see that indeed we had a higher share of younger people, but the youngest group were not as elected, it's concentrated in the median age, on the younger but over 30 group, which is the second group. If we compare the composition with the Chamber of Deputies, we see a strong change. So it's a renewal. We have much younger members. In the Chamber of Deputies, we have over 70% that are older than 45 years old. And in the Constitutional Convention, we have less than 50%. So we have a strong renewal in terms of age. And it's interesting because here I separate this by coalitions in the Chamber of Deputies and the Constitutional Convention. And we see again the same pattern as we saw in women. So it's the independent list that bring more younger people into the assembly, and the more traditional list, la lista del apruebo and Chile Vamos, continue with a less strong concentration on older people, but still they maintain a little the same logic. And we also, finishing, we also want to see in terms of renewal and political experience, we compare those who had participated in a previous election versus those who have never participated in a previous election. We have in the Chamber of Deputies over 80% have experience, have run in a previous election before. In the candidates, we see the exact opposite. 80% have never run on an election before. And in the convention, we also observe the same. So it's important to note that the electability was not as affected by running before, and quite the contrary. So again, we observe this by coalitions, and it's interesting to observe the same pattern again. So we have the independents, of course, are less likely to have run before. But the important point here is that comparing with the Chamber of Deputies, even in the traditional groups, coalitions, we observe a renewal of more people that have not run before, which are the red bars. And there's been a lot of discussion about the professions and trades of people within the Constitutional Convention. So again, the oranges are the convention members and the green are the candidates. So what we observe that there were people with less levels of education that run as candidates, but they weren't as successful. The most successful group, as we can see, are the ones related with lawyers. We have almost 40% of the current convention are lawyers, and more than 90% have university studies. So people had non-university educated people on their ballot, but mostly chose educated people, or university educated people. And finally, and ending, because I think I'm running a little short, this is the composition. So it dramatically changed the composition and the alienation of forces. We have the Chamber of Deputies, 46% for the Chile Vamos, 24% now, which was what Claudio mentioned, but new forces entered. We have Lista del Pueblo, Apruebo Dignidad, which is closely, but with the PC as Frente Amplio, La Lista del Apruebo, and important independent lists. Within the others, there's like 1 or 2% that run as independents. So all the success of the independents or non-affiliated with parties comes from the possibility of running as lists. So, well, and to finish, what are the possibilities of agreements within the Constitutional Convention? We have in increased numbers of parties. It's impossible to calculate a number of effective parties because we have more independents, non-affiliated, but we have a lot of pacts. And furthermore, within the pacts that are built on parties like Apruebo Dignidad, Lista del Apruebo, Vamos por Chile, they incorporated a lot of independents within. So almost half of the elected within political pacts come from the independent. So to finish, this is the slide when you distinguish between political coalitions, those that are party members, and those that are from run the political coalition, but run as independents within, or as we say in Spanish, the grupo de, which are the ones that have the slashes in red. And as you observe, it becomes more fragmented. So I think that, I'm running out of time, but I think that what's important to see is how would you, how homogeneous or mostly the heterogeneity of independent lists, but also within coalitions, usually more homogeneous. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thank you for putting numbers into the more abstract reflection when we say that there is no trust on political parties or the crisis. To have numbers really help understand how serious is this issue. Second aspect that I think that is very important is the level of fragmentation. You put in the last slide a real rainbow, and struck me with the division that you made. The first group is Del Pueblo, 17%, then Vamos por Chile, 14%, and then the reserved seats of the indigenous become the third. So in your allocation, and I see that Claudio is not probably in agreement, so I think that it will be very important to clarify that to what extent this is the right picture to really to understand what are the numbers and the different groups that made the composition of the new assembly. But very, very useful. Thank you so much. Give us a lot of information about also the renewal of the leadership that is taking place with more young people, more women, and so forth. I would like to invite now Isabel for 8 minutes. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the Wilson Center for this invitation, and it's an honor to be here with this panel. So I'm going after Carmen because she showed data, and so I'm going to use what she showed to make some points. The first, of course, this result, as we're discussing here, the results of this election has given us multiple space for analysis. It was an enormously complex election. We are analyzing one today, but let's remember that there were 4 simultaneous elections, 2 of which we had never held before. There were 5 ballots. There were different electoral systems, different political lists. One election, this one, the constitutional, for the Constitutional Convention, we had, as Carmen mentioned, unique rules that we had never implemented before. So I'm sure this will be one of many panels that we will be together in. So I want to focus these remarks on 2 questions that have to do with certain issues of the Constitutional Convention in light of the results. So the first one, as Carmen just showed, the main result of this election, or one of the main results, has been that we have a highly fragmented convention. So, but why is this relevant for the convention itself? Of course, fragmentation is always interesting to analyze for the political scientist, but we have to remember that the convention has been established under a certain set of rules, right? The rules, those legal conventions, have been established on our current constitution, and the convention itself cannot modify them. And they include, for example, the duration of the convention, right? We have 9 months that can be extended for 3 months only for one time, so a total of 12 months. We have the objective of the constitution. It has to draft the proposal of the new constitution. And then we have some substantive limits. Chile has to be a republic, it has to be a democracy, it has to respect international treaties, and other rules. But one specifically important set of rules, it's the quorum, the 2/3 quorum. And this quorum is, I would say it's required for 2 moments, I will call them. One is for establishing the rules of procedure, which the convention has to give itself. And the other one is for approving the content and the norms of the Constitution. So 2/3 of 155, it's 103 votes. And as the results show, and Carmen just showed, no single list obtained the 2/3 majority, but also no single list obtained the 1/3 to block a proposal. And this is interesting because over the last few months, the 2/3 quorum had been read as the idea that the right would obtain the 1/3 and would be the sector that would be acting as a restraining bloc, right? So the last few months, we saw a lot of discussion over the rules of procedure under this scenario. Under the scenario that there was 1/3 of the convention, which was blocking or was restraining the convention from advancing, and how would we resolve many stalemate scenarios? I think the question now has changed. The debate now is centered on how the 2/3 will be obtained. The 2/3, as we know, it's a high quorum. It has been observed in other constitutional assemblies, but it requires a lot of negotiation and the formation of big coalitions. And the question, due to this fragmentation that we just saw in numbers, is how the 2/3 will be formed, who will be leading the different sectors, and mainly if there's one coalition that will be able to sustain itself through 12 months, or if we'll be seeing multiple formations of coalitions during this period. So instead of having 3 clearly identified sectors, there's a high probability that it will translate into different associations and block formations over the 12 months, maybe depending on timing. Let's remember that we have a presidential election in between, right? Or maybe depending on different issues. So if we, for example, if you review the proposals of those who have been elected, you can see that there's, for example, an ample support for gender issues, sexual reproductive rights, gender equality norms. There's also an ample support for environmental and sustainability issues. The same, for example, in constitutional regulation of water access and water rights, on some type of a recognition of indigenous peoples. But I cannot establish, for example, a foreseeable scenario on how the 2/3 will operate or will be obtained on other issues. For example, the political regime. Will we change the presidential system to a semi-presidential or a parliamentary system? How will we regulate the judiciary, the Supreme Court, the autonomy of the central bank, or many other organic aspects of the Constitution? So I think the fragmentation will be one of the main challenges for the convention, and it will introduce political uncertainty on how the rules of procedure will now be sort of configured. So how the 2/3 quorum will operate, we had debates on if it had to operate on a series of votes, a final vote, how the convention will sort of establish itself in committees, the number of committees, rules of transparency, those things are included in the rules of procedure. And of course, I cannot anticipate the political negotiations here. It's impossible today to do that, but I think it will be interesting to see how this one big challenge, which is establishing these rules of convention, will show the negotiations and sort of the types of agreements that can be reached. And I should mention that there's no deadline set for the rules of convention, and we see in compared experiences very different periods of time. In Colombia, it was 15 days. In Bolivia, if I remember correctly, it was 9 months or 6 months. And so that's the second question. The second question, very briefly, is Carmen showed, and Claudia also mentioned, the impressive results obtained by independent candidates, right? Both on lists, also a single candidate, which is more rarely. But the other side is that there's an extended disappointment of the results of the political parties, right? And I think it's very interesting to see how this will impact the discussion of the convention. Some elected members have explicitly manifested an anti-political party position. Of course, this scenario is not unique in Chile. Daniel, you just mentioned, right, the issue of the crisis of the model of political representation. And as Carmen mentioned, independent candidates have opened up the political spectrum, brought new faces, new professions, people from different locations in Chile. But I think the question for the convention is how this sort of anti-political party or traditional political party sentiment will translate into the discussion of the future constitutional norms of political parties, but also of representative democracy. So how is this idea that some elected members have sustained of sort of being a representative without representing in the traditional sense will impact the regulation of, for example, the system of government, of plebiscites and referendums, or of the regulation of the electoral system, of the regulation of political parties itself, and so forth, Congress itself. So I think the question here is if as I believe, and as we often say over and over, is democracy to work must have strong political parties. So how will this play within the convention with this configuration, and what are the challenges that we see and the instruments that we have for strengthening political parties under this scenario? I think this will be, of course, a question for the convention, but also will be a question that for political parties today, as we saw yesterday, but for the political system as a whole for the coming years.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you for putting on the table two critical issues. The critical issue of fragmentation. I think that we need to go back then in order to have a more clear picture about how fragmented is and what are the main groups. Using probably your last slide, Carmen, and see to what extent there is a consensus around that or there are different views. And the other critical issue is the role of political parties and how this anti-party sentiment that many of the new members of the convention are already having, how this is going to affect, and what is the legal position that political parties are going to have in the new constitution, and how this is going to affect also future role of the political parties. Now is the turn of Lucia. Lucia, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes to give your view, and then we will go to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the Wilson Center and Idea Internacional. It's always nice to be with all of you. I've learned a lot. It's, you know, and it's also the best to be the last one because everything has been said already. So I have 3 specific issues. One is, although there is fragmentation and although there is a lot of shocks in Chile nowadays, specifically for us who are, you know, political junkies, my sense is that the right wing lost a lot. In this fragmentation, it's true that we have lots of independents, but those independent people, I would say, are more left-wing than right-wing. And in that sense, before, when Isabel said that, of course, the right-wing was, you know, supposed to be heading towards the 1/3 in order to be sure to veto some ideas or to make a barrier for some ideas. Now they don't have it, and my sense is that it's gonna be very difficult for them to have it. That it doesn't mean that the other side will all get together, of course, because the other side is a kaleidoscope, you know, it changes every movement. So it's very difficult to get together. However, after the election, I would probably say that the Constitution will be more progressive, more, I wouldn't call it left-wing, but more progressive than we expected before the election. And most of those people who are younger, who are open to new ideas, who all kind of are distant from political parties, they show us a dilemma or a paradox. And the paradox is that now, more than ever in the last 30 years, citizens are talking about politics. There is an increasing, you know, level of politicization of conversation regarding 2 specific issues: environmental issues and gender. So those conversations are not getting any feedback or any echo on political parties. So if you have a crisis of political parties, but you have more politicization in their everyday conversation within society, then political parties have to change, or political parties have to be formed, or some new reference have to be arrive, because, you know, there is an ample space for people to get represented. And my sense is that that ample space represents the left wing. I'm not saying that that is Frente Amplio or Communist Party, but there is something in that area. And that's a paradox that we really need to figure that out. That in that sense, the question is, would this election show something for the presidential election? Can we really predict that the presidential election will be more prone towards the left than the right wing? I'm not sure. And I think there is a huge question mark regarding how the electorate will move. But for sure, you know, those who got elected to the Constitutional Convention will try to play the electoral debate in the next 3 or 4 months. Because although I know the rules of the convention have been established, but even very not left-wing like Benito Baranda, conventional elected people are discussing the possibility to revisit it, to revisit the rules of the convention, revisit the rule of the 2/3. So there will be a little bit of turmoil until, you know, the convention start really working. That turmoil is going to be, unfortunately, is going to be tainted by the electoral process. And I'm not sure if, you know, we will have a different electorate, or if this process of fragmentation could also be playing a role in the next presidential election. If that's the case, we're going to have all type of initiatives during the conventional constitutional convention, because of course there is all incentives to have the lights on you, proposing several very creative initiatives during the electoral time. So I think we have to be very careful what happened during that time. And of course, as I think Isabel or Carmen said, I think that there are topics that are very much, and Claudio also very much discussed. I'm pretty sure the role of the state is going to be changed. Of course, this is going to be an environmentally friendly constitution, which is easier to say than to define in a country that base its economic development on natural resources and mining. So this is not a country that is based on technology and development, you know, it's based on mining. So how can you develop a new state-of-the-art constitution that is environmentally friendly while basically developing your pillars of the economic organization on natural resources? That's something that I'm not sure how they are going to manage to do. But the type of government, I'm not sure if they will be able to get an agreement. And this is my last point, because I know we have a short time, but even within those in the left coalition, there are not agreement on the type of government that we have to have. Even within lawyers and political scientists, there is lots of discussion on presidentialism, semi-presidentialism, and parliamentarism. So when we get to that discussion, I think that forming the quorums needed for the change is going to be really difficult. And I am not really sure how we are going to manage to move forward that huge barrier in order to have a new constitution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Very good 3 points. Again, how this is going to impact. And I would like then to come back to this issue, because we have 2 simultaneous processes, one in the constitutional, drafting a new constitution, and the other one is to run a presidential election and congressional election. So this constitution will have 2 presidents, 2 different Congress in just 9 or 12 months. This is quite unique. I don't recall any other experience where you have the 2 things together. And it's not only how this process and this result is going to affect the presidential election. It's the other way around. It will depend very much how the new administration, whatever is elected, may try to affect the work of the convention. So very, very critical point. Also the relation between the mining central key role that plays in the economy vis-a-vis the intention to have a more environmental constitution. That is also a very, very important issue to discuss. About the political regime, I think that I would like to hear your views, because I think that Claudio was telling us this morning in another seminar, the worst case scenario is that you come out of this process with a more weak presidential system and more highly fragmented Congress. So, I mean, if you are looking for disaster, this may one possible scenario. So I think that we need to be very, well, they will need to be very cautious about that. Cynthia, tell us which is the right place for all the audience that are listening us to send the Q&A. We have a lot of them already, but please repeat exactly that one.
Sure. Anybody in the audience who would like to submit a question for the panel, either to a particular panelist or to everybody, please send it to our Twitter account. I neglected to mention this earlier. The Twitter address is @LATAMPROG, LATAMPROG. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. We have our own commercial advice here. And now, please join me, Cynthia, with questions to our speakers and panelists. I would like to start with one. Will you please help us to really understand to the audience what is next? Because it was very clear where are we coming from. But what is next and for how long this process will continue and what are the main challenges? Claudio, please help us to have a picture about the next steps.
Sure. What will be happening in early July, at the end of June, the convention has to meet for the first time, and they have to vote for 50% plus one. They have to choose one president and one vice president, and they have to have some administrative decisions, like an external advisory committee for the dieta and all these kind of things, and then they have to work in the internal rules for procedures for the convention. So, and they don't have a deadline for that. So everyone here is scared about, not everyone, but the elite in general are scared about what will happen about the rules, the internal rules, because you can trap in these debates and then do not discuss the constitutional provisions. So you will have the discussion on the internal rules, how many commissions, what are the rules of decision, all the participatory mechanism for citizens to make claims to the convention, transparency rules, conflict of interest rules, that kind of things. And then you have 9 months to work in the Constitution. I mean, from the start, like from June to 9th month, and you can extend this for 3 months. So probably it will be 1 year, and after a year, if they have an agreement or if they don't have an agreement, like a text, the convention have to dissolve, and then you will have a call for a plebiscite if you have a text, and the 60 days after you have a plebiscite. So by the September, around early September, you might have a plebiscite on whether you accept or reject the new constitution. The new constitution, if it's rejected, you will continue with the same. So you have two incentives to have a text, which is the 12-month deadlines, and then the eventual rejection by the citizens. So there is strong incentive to make an agreement on something different from what is going on right now with the Constitution.
Sorry, Daniel, if I can add
sure,
two things.
Sure.
Just in the first session, the 155 members have to elect the president and vice president. And that election is by majority. So it doesn't have the 2/3. And also the other thing is that the final plebiscite, what we call in Chile plebiscito de salida, which Claudio just referred to, has mandatory voting. And so that has a different rule, since we had this discussion at the beginning of the panel about who didn't vote. We sort of will be seeing a change probably, and I bet a further discussion on mandatory voting or not. But it's important to note that this discussion on who's voting and who's not voting will probably sort of be analyzed all through this process.
And if I can just say something, the main issue about the plebiscito de salida is that we have 6 million people who has probably never voted. And we don't really know how this is going to play out. So the more cohesive the new constitution is, the better for the plebiscite. Because if you have people who are not into it because of gender issues or environmental issues or the role of the state, then you start, losing possibilities to have a majority in the plebiscite. So my main concern is how we are going to really work towards including society in a very active way during the constitutional debate. If we fail to include society, then even though we have a great document, we're going to lose the plebiscite because they will feel that once again, they were, lost in translation. And that's really, really bad.
Very good points. Cynthia.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience from Juan Andres Abarca. And it's a question I think that a number of us have, which is, given this tremendously complex process of needing 2/3 quorum for the various articles to pass, and the extreme fragmentation of the assembly, do you think that the timeline of 1 year is enough? Considering Andres says that the maximalist approach seems to be the one gaining traction. Who wants to take that question?
Yeah, sure. Well, Gabriel Negreto has addressed that in library recently, and yeah, it's true. I mean, in terms of like in terms of the comparative experience, it is a very short time. Well, with some exception, Colombia, for instance, which was very fast. And I think that, as I think Lucia said, after the convention get together, probably they might have some discussion of revising some rules, including that, which might create a conflict because any rules that you can change, a minority vote can request to the Supreme Court a revision of these procedural decisions. So I don't think that you might have an environment for changing the main rules defined by the Constitution, which is 2/3, and this provision of revising the timing and revising other things, which is some of the groups are proposing a plebiscite in intermediary plebiscite, like conflicts that are during the debate, might be plebiscite or might be consultation to the citizenship that are mandatory, that kind of things, and probably might not pass in this. So these kind of things will be debated, but I think that the time frame is probably will not change. I don't know what you think, the rest of the panel.
Any other views that the convention will have the power to extend the period if that is needed and not to have the limit of the 9 + 3 months that exist already?
So the only way to do this under the current rules is that Congress, the president, would have to amend the current constitution in order to change the rules of the convention, right? But I think two things. One is that so the original timeline or time frame was set before COVID-19, right? So we didn't have a presidential election in between, and because of the pandemic, we had to reschedule the whole timeline, and so that, as Lucia mentioned, we are seeing some political negotiations in between that were not set from the beginning, right? This agreement comes from, oh, now I've lost time, but it's 2019, right? So that what we're seeing now sort of was not originally planned because of COVID. And the second issue is that I think one crucial thing will be how long will the convention take for the rules of procedures? Because what we see in international studies of constitutional assemblies is that this can vary greatly. And if the convention takes a lot of time to set up the rules of procedure, then you have less time to discuss content, of course. So that has to be it's a very important discussion, but if it takes too long, then you will see sort of probably less debate on the constitutional norms, or in parallel, you will see debate that is not regulated under transparency rules or commissions and committees. But I don't see sort of, I may be wrong, I don't know what the rest say, but I don't see sort of now the idea of extending the period of time. It's sort of incorporated, at least for now.
But to be absolutely clear, it's not the convention who can change and extend the duration, it's the Congress. But since we are having one Congress now and we are going to have a new Congress after March, it is not clear that it's probably the new Congress who will have to make this decision if this decision is needed.
But remember that Congress, to change these rules, has to achieve a 2/3 majority.
Absolutely, I understand that.
And so you have the same quorum.
Yes.
And as Claudio mentioned, there's a procedure before the Supreme Court in case some rules of procedure are violated, and you need 39 members or signatures for that procedure.
So it's not easy.
No.
It's not easy to change the rules, but it's not impossible also.
Can I add one footnote? One problem is that happened in other Latin American countries. Imagine this scenario. The convention by unanimity say, hey, we need more time. It's not 2/3, like everyone is say, okay, yeah, we need 18 months. What happened in that time, in that case? Because it's the original power. I mean, it's the constituent power. So, and then you have the conflict with the Supreme Court, and then you might have the problem of passing a bill, as Isabel was saying. So you have a more liquid institutional time, I think.
Yeah, I agree that this is going to be a really hectic and turbulent moment. Just my only say is that all independent and almost everyone is saying that in order to have a legitimate constitution, and that's the basis for what we are changing the previous one, we need to have participation. We need to have active social involvement. And nowadays with COVID, it's very difficult. And I'm not sure if active involvement is, Zoom meetings. I'm pretty sure that will not work for many people. So my sense is that if we continue under this idea that today we have more people with COVID than yesterday, a lot more. Perhaps COVID will play a role in order to, bring more time, not because of the political plays, which of course perhaps too, but on the sense of bringing possibilities to further discuss these issues. There was one or two strong candidates who actually proposed that the convention could go to other regions in Chile. How can we organize that during COVID? So that I just want to mention that because this is a nuance in the process too.
Thank you, Lucia. Carmen, you want to add something about this?
No, just mention the issue of superposing the election and extending the period. We have a Congress and a president making decisions without having an empowered Congress now and an empowered president assuming some sort that is making decisions and making public policy, while a constitutional convention may be changing the rules of the game. So I think also in terms of political public policy, in terms of actual outcomes that Chile needs, it's not, you have a tension. Maybe we need more time to debate more easily and define everything. But on the other hand, Chile cannot stay in the earth waiting for the Constitutional Convention to decide. So I think that's a big issue to take into account, and that I'm sure it will be taken into account. And also with, as mentioned, the political participation. There's a lot of, especially independents, that have this idea of more consulting, more political participation. As Lucia and others mentioned, I don't think it's viable to have a new plebiscite, especially with everything that it's involved in, but certainly there should be, and I think there will be some sort of citizen participation, because the legitimacy is not guaranteed by the election, but it's an ongoing process. And I think that will be very important to see how it plays out. And again, this is a tension with the rules of procedure. We need to define them not quite kind of quickly. Well, many open questions basically, but I think we have a tension with the government and governability of the next presidents and next Congress that also should be taken into account.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Back to you, Cynthia.
Yep. Two questions that I'd like to put out that are very, very different. One from Francisco Monaldi of the Baker Institute at Rice University. It's a very procedural question to explain the electoral system that was used for assigning the seats in the convention, and what effect did that have, and how different would the convention look if the binomial system of the past would have been used. And then from Marlene Fernandez of Arcos Dorados, two questions that are related. One about how can you explain the fact that no one predicted such a strong showing from the radical left, and also related to something that was touched on earlier in the presentations about looking ahead to what you think the impact will be on the presidential elections. So two very different questions. Maybe if not everybody answers both of them, if you could choose. Isabel, maybe you're the best one to start with.
No.
No?
It's Carmen
Okay.
or Claudia, I think,
Okay.
here for the electoral system.
Whoever wants to take it on this question of the procedure for naming.
I'll take it.
Okay.
So the Constitutional Convention, the rules for the general elections are the actual electoral rules and the formula are the same than for the Chamber of Deputies of 2017. What changed? Parity, which is a big change, the reserved seats, but also what changed a lot and made a real difference in terms of, as I mentioned before, the number of independents elected was the ability or the capacity to form list of independents. Previously, you couldn't do that. you have to run, if you wanted to have a pact, you have to run a party that was constituted, and it was difficult. Now the requisites were lowered, so it's more easy. So that's a big change. Comparing with the binomial system, I think it will be really, really different. But what I want also to point out that the institutional innovations like parity, reserved seats, and the enabling of lists change the composition from the previous Chamber of Deputies, which was elected with the same electoral rules. So I have no doubt that will be different. Parity brought a whole new different incentives for parties to incorporate more women and more competitive women than the gender quota of 2017. So I'm sure if we had a gender quota on the convention, we wouldn't have the results that we are observing now. We have reserved seats, and we wouldn't have also as many as independents as we have currently. We haven't allowed or lowered the requisites to form independent lists. So, and compared with the binomial will be starkly different. And I'm sure the legitimacy of that will be.
So essentially, it's not that the current Chamber of Deputies was elected by binomial and this is a PR. It was PR in the past, PR now, but the only main difference are the adjustment of the PR that took place in this election that make a completely different outcome, right?
The binomial was used last time for the 2013 election. The new proportional system was used for the 2017 and 2021. The only difference is that for the reserved seats, you diminish the magnitude from 8 to 7, so you can add them, but it's mostly the other innovations that matter.
Okay. The other question that was posed, who wants to take that?
What was the question?
Claudio, I'll give this one to you in terms of making predictions about the composition of the new assembly. You know, how would you, let's start with this. How would you characterize the number of seats or the representation of the radical left? Those were the words that were used in the question. And was this predicted, or, you know, and if not, why? Let's put it that way.
Well, I don't know if you agree, Isabel, Lucia, Carmen, but I think that it was not predicted at all, with some exception, like Sergio Toro was saying, you know, see what is going on in the regions, but in general, it was not predicted. And now, what happened is that yeah, it's hard to characterize as like a traditional political left. It's not like an organized movement or a lefty movement like MAS in Bolivia in the early 2000s or PT in Brazil. It was nothing like that. It was thanks to the reform that Isabel referred concerning the allowing independent lists, several groups like territorial groups that were claiming, many of them very small in the territories in the north and in the south, they took the opportunity, they organized themselves and they present a list. So when we see, when one see the programs, what they are suggesting is in the lines that Lucia was saying. First, environment. I mean, climate change, environment regulation, a very critical view on extractivism, for instance, because of the impact in the communities. Many of these communities have been very affected by mining in the north, by the fisheries in the south. So a strong accent or emphasis on environment issues. Second, feminism is very transversal to, I mean, is very relevant third, direct democracy as a form of government. Why they won election? Because they did the job. I mean, they went to the people and they talked to them and say, okay, we are tired of the same stuff that the traditional political parties were saying. And if you see the center parties, the PPD, Christian Democracy, Partido Radical, collapsed, basically. I mean, the Christian Democracy got 1 seat, and the other one, it was an independent that ran within the list of the Christian Democracy. I mean, it was totally disappeared, the Christian Democracy. So the center parties were the most affected by this. The Socialist Party remained quite the same, and a very increased vote for the Communist Party and for the Frente Amplio. So I think that this group, independent group, were very in tune of the demand of people, and they were very able to get the people to vote with no money, by the way.
Okay, we are getting into the last 20 minutes. There are a few more questions. I will say several questions. I will appreciate very much if we can get more concrete answers so we can cover all those issues. Isabel, you want to make a comment?
Yeah,
right?
very short. So just that we are analyzing the elections of the convention, right? But let's remember that there were 4 elections here, and the data it's still very recent. But the results of the convention, because of these special rules, right, sort of show different things that if you analyze the elections of the local governments, municipalidades, which we had 2 elections, mayors and then the council, and also a new election, which is the regional governors, which also have a different electoral system with a 40% voting requirement. So I think we will see for the coming days much more global analysis, which can sort of give more lights on what is coming next, which is the presidential and parliamentary race.
Okay. One of the reactions, not coming from the political front, but from the private sector and the market, is that people get very concerned. The stock market is going down now for the 4th consecutive day. The country risk went up, the dollar went up, and so forth. Since this is going to be a long process, at least 15, 18 months, and there is a high level of uncertainty because Chile decided for many years not to change anything and now decided to change everything. There is no any other country that is going to have the number of elections in just 1 year as Chile is going to have in 2021. All positions are going to go to the poll. And also you want to change the constitution, and also you want to replace the president, and also you want to have a new Congress all at the same time. And of course, private sector people and many others, because of the outcome, start getting quite concerned. I think that we don't have any economists in the panel, but what is your initial reaction? How these 2 words are going to be? A convention that will try to please the demands from the citizens because they otherwise run the risk that the constitution is not going to be approved. But at the same time, you cannot just give the sense that this is going to be like a Christmas tree because this is going to have implication and probably money flying out of the country. What is your assessment, Lucia?
Yeah, that relates to the previous discussion. I think that, as a friend of mine said, all the left in Chile was the right in other countries in Latin America. So just forget about the radical left. The thing is that for many years, nothing really changed in terms of the political discussion in Chile. And that stability was supposed to be really good. And it was prized as the unique situation of Chile. And transition was, considered a very good, because no one really discussed the profound issues of the neoliberal model, you know, the role of the armed forces, and so on and so forth. So my perception is that now we are changing everything, that because for many years we evaded the discussion of everything. And nowadays, when copper is going up in international prices, we have to get used to turbulence. That's the name of the game. I mean, if you really want to live in a country that nothing moves, well, I don't know, where are you going to go? To the US? Are you going to go to Spain? I mean, really, the world is changing, and Chile is perhaps changing more because of the lack of structural debates in the last 30 years. But nowadays that you have, you know, indigenous people saying that they will go to the Constitution and use their own language, people are running like crazy because they don't know what to do. I mean, that happens, I mean, in other countries, that indigenous people decided to use their language, and we should be able to provide, at the state, should be able to provide, you know, interpreters, and that shouldn't be like something weird. But because those issues were not discussed, now they're, you know, considered as an element of concern. My sense is that you have, within the economic power, you also have differences. It's not like everyone is trying to move to Miami, you know, when they will really have to fight for, you know, business. I think that after October 2019, even the right-wing people, and of course the people in the private sector, realized that the country has to change, and there are many ways to change it. So my sense is that we have to be used to of, you know, turbulence for a while. We will have to be used to of listening to the other that was left of the conversation for many years, and that will require us to be more open to different perception of life and, you know, many other issues. But at the end, this is going to be a better country. So, you know, turbulence is not always the first step towards, you know, the end of the world. We can, you know, have some turbulence and then define a better society, a society in which indigenous people, for instance, as well as women and others, have a place to their topics. That's my sense.
Thank you, Lucia. Any other comment before I go back to Cynthia? Okay, Cynthia, back to you.
Sure, thanks. I have sort of a two-part question. Lucia, what you're suggesting in terms of the optimistic scenario that Chile will be a better country is not at all, you know, suggested by the process that's about to get underway and that was underway in the election, in the sense that as much as people recognize in the private sector, you know, in social movements, whatever, a need to change the status quo, which clearly didn't work for a lot of people, and that's why they were on the streets, that some of the fundamentals that made Chile a stable country, all of that will be done away with. And nobody's saying that Chile is going to become Venezuela or Bolivia or whatever, but that these constitutional processes can have a way of, to use the tired metaphor in English, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that you're not going to come out with something that is social democratic and inclusive in nature, but something genuinely unworkable, that, you know, protecting indigenous lands and water rights will mean that the mining sector, which is the engine of the Chilean economy, can't function. I mean, in a way, and I think part of the question comes from a sense that we're not talking about a country that was fundamentally right-wing since the democratic transition. It was fundamentally a country that was center-left. And yet had all of these, you know, unmet demands. So I guess the question is, do you all have faith, given the current composition of the assembly, that the constitution that will come out of this process will be workable. I mean, yes, you need to diminish perhaps the complete prioritization of private property, give a greater role for the state, but will it achieve a certain balance, or will it be dramatically skewed to one side?
Who wants to go first? Claudio, you are the... No, you don't want to lead?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Dear Cindy, I think that we need to discuss your premises. I know that you don't, I mean, it's not your premises, but what people said about Chile. First, the idea of like throwing away all the economic growth, the benefit of 30 years is, the question is, I think that is who benefit from that economic process. And I think that the problem that, that come out from the election is that some people, like a lot of people, are not very happy about the result of this. So the idea of exclusion of people that, I mean, when you see those that were elected independent, the stories, the trajectories of them are people that are fighting against that the lake are becoming a trash because of the salmon industry. In the north is people that are working, like for instance, Cristina Dorador. She's a scientific in the university working because of the pollution that the mining sector is affecting Antofagasta. And she was working for 10 years on that, and she became a very relevant scientific, like a biologist, studying the contamination of waters, of cellars, of Antofagasta, of the city. So I think that the perception of the benefits of the model, it suddenly say, hey, you know, we are tired of this. We are not getting the benefit and we want these benefits. So the premise of that, this economic model that was so booming, et cetera, was affecting for all equally is not, I think, true, at least electorally. The second thing is that, okay, you have a center-left governing, but it was not governing for the people, it was governing for the right because of the fact that that center-left government never had the majority to make certain big changes in the constitution, in the, for instance, what are the main issues today in the debate? Water rights, which are in the constitution, which is probably the first thing that will get out of the constitution will be water rights. That is for sure. Indigenous rights. I think that Chile will become an state that is plurinational. You have the majority right now with this election of having a state that is plurinational. Is because of the struggle that is crazy in the South. So I think that the problem is that today the coalition that won is not a coalition, but the people that won this seat are reflecting this other Chile. And I think that that is the interesting part of this. It's very interesting that the list, that the third majority list, the Lista del Pueblo, is called Lista del Pueblo. I mean, for the first time, the Pueblo become an actor in the convention, which is interesting, like politically. So going back to the question, do you think that we will have a better country, et cetera, will all depend on the agreements that they might reach. I mean, I think that the constitution, the debate about the constitution is about right. I agree with Lucia that probably this constitution will move toward a more social democrat, a more kind of a more relevant role of the state, a more relevant role of social rights, et cetera, et cetera. Concerning property rights, probably it will have some limitations, water rights, the role of the state within the like making business, that kind of things will have a strong right. Should this will become a nationalization of rights? Probably not. Probably they will not get that. So I'm kind of optimistic, but cautious because the negotiations need to take place. We need to not to polarize this and not to block each minority within the convention. And this is a little bit, there are a lot of uncertainty about that. But for instance, one of the main concerns of the investor is autonomy of the central bank. Is that at risk? I don't think so. I mean, most of the people within the convention that have been asked, at least in the poll that they respond, the actual convention representative are not, I mean, the majority is supporting that, maybe changing some of the functions of the central bank, but not limiting the autonomy of the central bank. So I cautiously optimistic about what will happen with this convention.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Like in a TV program, we are running out of time. We have only 6 minutes to go. I beg you, the 3 remaining speakers, to concentrate your final reflections within the 2 minutes each, so we can close. Lucia.
No, I talked too much already, so I leave my my final remarks to Carmen and Isabel. I agree with Claudio. I think we have to be positive and optimistic, and we have to work with our audiences. We are different in Chile to make sure that, you know, conversation and dialogue is open. If we close the possibility of dialogue, then we will go back to September or to September 2019, and that's something that no one really wants to go back.
Thank you, Lucia. Now, Carmen.
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think a bit of precisions. I think we indeed have some issues in terms of environmental issues, certainly. But I think there's it's no longer a consensus. That is a question, even within us, as you saw, of the benefits that we have accrued. We have increased the expectancy. We have water, potable water. So the model has some flaws. But I wanted to make the point. I think it still works. We have some adjustments to make, certainly, and I think that's part of the issue, because if you ask the people, and I think that's and that's what I wanted to discuss, people are not that upset with the model per se, with the distribution of rewards versus equality, with the role of the state. It's kind of not polarized. What I think is, and what stopped before, is a discontent with the elites and with the entrenchments of the elites and this attachment of the elites, of the political parties, so I think we should be cautious of over-interpreting the results. I think people are more moderate. There's a concern over so what's actually Claudia mentioned, you know, the list of the people, la lista del pueblo, because people felt that they were not listened to. So I think that one of the biggest advantages of this institutionalization is actually to bring a legitimate pact. So it's important to have citizen participation, to listen to everybody. But I think that we should be more cautious in terms of the economic process. Certainly we have some issues. Regarding what will change or not, I think that's an open discussion. And I cannot venture at this point of time what will be changed or not. It seems that the central bank autonomy is recognized by many people as really advantageous to the country. So it seems that that won't change. Other issues probably are more open for debate. But I think, and this I would like to end with this, if we listen to the citizens, I think we will get a more moderate and more reasonable constitution that if we not. So because citizen Chileans much more reasonable and much less polarized around this than the elites. And I think it's important that the new elites that are coming to the conventional actually represent that and not become polarized as well, discussing things that do not reflect the feelings of the majority of the citizens. So that's mine.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Isabel, you have your final comments and then we are going to close. I was saying this morning that I read two different approaches, one from Professor Ackerman, who said that after this constitution, Chile will become a Nordic country, and he compared Chile becoming like a Denmark, without mentioning, well, tax implications to become Denmark. Another one was Edwards, who wrote a few articles in the last week saying, okay, this is a disaster. Chile is going back to be a member of the Latin American group, will be placed between Costa Rica and Ecuador. We are losing all the competitive advantage. What is your view?
I have to find a new country, New Zealand.
New Zealand.
No, I want to say that very, very briefly, of course, but of course I'm a lawyer, so I look at the Constitution in a different way, less symbolic, more technical, but I think it's important to, or at least what I think is that in Chile we have a problem with the political system. And the Constitution can do so much, right? The Constitution is very important for a better functioning political system. But it can do so much as well. So many of the things that we're observing in the last few days, and yesterday in Chile was a very moved political day, it's a sort of a reconstruction of the political parties and of the political, from the center right, the center left, and the left, that it's very important that it's going to go beyond what the Constitution may or may not achieve. And I think the question for the coming years, it's how do we have a better function political system that then can absorb and improve the lives of all the people who live in Chile, even if some issues are or are not recognized in the Constitution. We will have sort of this challenge for the years ahead. And it's important to recognize that the Constitution can do very much, but it can also do very little. And the challenges lie within it, but also outside of it.
Thank you very much. With these final remarks on behalf of my colleague and friend Cynthia, the Woodrow Wilson Center, International IDEA, we want to really thank you for your outstanding presentation, for your participation, Lucia, Claudio, Carmen, and Isabel. Thank you very much. I think that all of us have enjoyed a lot. And we would like to have a commitment with you that we will see in 3, 4, 5 months time to take the pulse again and see how much progress and what are the challenges that are lying ahead. So thank you so much. Good afternoon. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for inviting.